One morning, as Gregor Samsa woke from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a very large, creepy crawly. He lay on his armor-like back, and lifting his head a little, he could see his belly, brown and divided into stiff or hard sections, 部位. His many, pitifully thin legs waved about helplessly. What has happened to me? He thought. It wasn't a dream. This was his room, a proper human room, although a little small, and there was his collection of textile samples, or cloth samples. For Samsa was a traveling salesman. Gregor looked out the window at the gray skies. Perhaps I might sleep a little longer and forget all this nonsense? What about if he reported sick? But that would be extremely suspicious. Gregor had never once been ill in his 15 years of service. There was a gentle knock at the door. Knock, knock, knock. Gregor! It was his mother. It's 7:15. Didn't you want to go somewhere? Gregor wanted to explain everything, but in the circumstances in this situation, contented himself with saying, Yes, mother, yes, thank you. He just said, Yes, mother, yes, thank you, instead of explaining everything to his mother. It was a simple matter for him to throw off the bed covers. But after that, it became rather difficult, especially as he had become so exceptionally wide. Not just wide, not just very wide, but exceptionally wide. He would have used his arms and his hands to push himself up. When he was a human, he had his hands. But instead of them, he only had all those little legs forever moving in different directions. He couldn't control his new legs. He wanted to get out of bed, but he had never yet seen the lower part of his new body, and it turned out to be rather hard to move. It went slowly. He bounced, boing, 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 against the bedpost and learned from the burning pain that the new body might well be rather sensitive. 7 o'clock already, he said to himself when the clock struck. But then he said, before it strikes 7:15, or 7:15, I will definitely have to be out of bed. Right now I'm in bed, I can relax, but by 7:15 I have to be out. Why? And by then, somebody will have come around from work to ask what's happened to me. And so he set himself, or he tried to get ready to the task of swinging his body out of the bed. His back seemed to be pretty tough, so might well withstand falling onto the carpet. If he falls on the carpet, his back is tough and hard, so he will not get hurt. He would have to just risk the loud noise it would make. The only thing he was afraid of was when he lands on the carpet, it will make a sound. Thump! And he was afraid that people will hear that sound. It occurred to him, or he realized, how simple everything would be if somebody came to help, perhaps his father and the maid. So it was hard for him to move, but nobody came to help him. After a while, he had worked so far across the bed that a simple rocking motion was ready to dislodge him. Then there was a ring at the door of the flat. Ding dong, ding dong. That will be someone from work, he said to himself, and froze or stopped moving very still, although his legs became all the more lively as they danced around. His body stopped moving, but the legs were moving very quickly. Gregor only needed to hear the visitor's first words, and he knew who it was, the chief clerk himself, or his boss. There was a loud thump, boom, and his fall was softened a little by the carpet. Gregor's back was more elastic than he had thought. "Something's fallen down in there," said the chief clerk, or the boss, whose footsteps in the highly polished boots could now be heard in the adjoining room. Adjoining room means the room next to Gregor's room, and then they are joined together. "Gregor," said his father from the room to his left, "please open up this door. I'm sure he'll be good enough to forgive the untidiness of your room." His father was worried that Gregor didn't want to open the door because his room was untidy or not clean. Then the chief clerk called, "Good morning, Mr. Samsa." "He isn't well," said his mother. "Mrs. Samsa," said the chief clerk, "I hope it's nothing serious, but we business people do have to try and overcome these little things. Can the chief clerk come in to see you now?" asked his father. "No," said Gregor. In his room on his left, his sister, Greta, began to cry. The chief clerk now raised his voice. "Mr. Samsa," he called, "what's wrong? You barricade or you separate yourself in your room? Your employer did suggest that your failure to appear or the fact that you don't want to come to work might not be unconnected with the money that was recently entrusted to you. Remember, we asked you to keep some money for the company. So maybe, I'm sure you're sick and you're not coming to work not because you want to keep that money, right?" But I doubt that could be right. "Sir," called Gregor, I'm just getting out of bed. It's not as easy as I'd thought. No need to wait, sir. I'll be in the office soon." Wait a minute. Did he understand a word of that? The chief clerk asked his parents. "Oh God," called his mother in tears. "He could be seriously ill." But Gregor had become much calmer, so they couldn't understand his words anymore. Although they seemed clear enough to him, it had become very quiet in the next room. Perhaps his parents were whispering with the chief clerk, or perhaps they were pressed against the door, listening. Gregor realized that every word that came out of his mouth, nobody could understand the words because he spoke like an insect now. And so the next door was very quiet. They were trying to listen to what Gregor was talking about. Gregor slowly pushed his way over to the door, using the adhesive on the tips of his legs. He then set himself to the task of turning the key in the lock with his mouth. He seemed, unfortunately, to have no proper teeth, so he couldn't open the door because he didn't have hands, he didn't have teeth either. "Listen," said the chief clerk in the next room. He's turning the key." Gregor was greatly encouraged, though he would have preferred, "Well done, Gregor." Then he lay his head on the handle of the door and he opened it. He heard the chief clerk exclaim aloud, "Oh!" like a sigh of the wind. Gregor's mother looked at his father, then she sank onto the floor into her skirts. His father clenched his fists. Then he looked uncertainly round the living room. Gregor leaned against the wall so that only half of his body could be seen, along with his head. "Well then," said Gregor, aware that he was the only one to have kept calm, "I'll get dressed right away." But the chief clerk turned away as soon as Gregor started to speak and only stared back at him over his trembling or shaking shoulders as he left. Gregor realized that it was out of the question to let the chief clerk go away in his mood if his position in the firm or company was not to be put into extreme danger. So Gregor wanted to chase after or go after his boss because his boss was really scared now, and he knew that if his boss was scared, he would get fired. Gregor knew that he would get fired. That was something his parents simply did not understand. They had become convinced that this job would provide for Gregor for life, that Gregor would keep this job forever. The chief clerk had to be calmed, convinced, 被说服, and finally won over. The future of Gregor and his family depended on it. So Gregor wanted to chase after the chief clerk so that he could explain, and then because his family depended on Gregor for the money that they used at home. The chief clerk had already reached the stairs when Gregor made a run for him. He wanted to be sure of reaching him, but the chief clerk leapt down several steps or jumped down several steps at once and disappeared. His shouts, "Ah!" resounding all around the staircase. Gregor's appeals to the father were of no help. He wanted to ask his father, "Help me, help me, help me." Why were they of no help? Because his appeals, his words were simply not understood. His father couldn't understand him anymore. Now, nothing would stop Gregor's father as he drove him back, hissing psst at him like a wild man. Gregor was as yet unskilled in moving backwards. He didn't know how to move backwards and was only able to go very slowly. If Gregor had been allowed to turn around, he would have been back in his room quite quickly. But his father seemed impatient. He lay at an angle in the doorway. One flank scraped on the door and was painfully injured, leaving vile brown flecks behind. Then his father gave him a hefty shove from behind, which sent him flying and heavily bleeding deep into his room. The door was slammed shut with a stick, then all was quiet. It was not until that evening that Gregor awoke from his deep sleep. The light from the electric street lamps shone palely here and there onto the ceiling and glistened on the furniture. But down below, where Gregor was, it was dark. He pushed himself over to the door, feeling his way clumsily with his antennae, of which he was now beginning to learn the value. One of the legs had been badly injured in the events of that morning and dragged along lifelessly. By the door, he discovered a bowl filled with sweetened milk with little pieces of bread floating in it. He was even hungrier than he had been that morning, so immediately dipped in. But the milk did not taste nice. Milk was normally his favorite drink, and his sister had certainly or for sure left it there for him because of that, because he liked milk a lot. But this time he turned away from the dish and crawled back into the center of the room. He spent the whole night there, barely sleeping, not sleeping at all. Why? From fear and hunger. He knew, however, that he must 1. Remain calm, show patience and consideration so that his family could bear the unpleasantness of his condition, so that his family will accept him again. Gregor soon had the opportunity to test the strength of his decisions. Early next morning, his sister opened the door and looked anxiously or nervously in. Gregor pushed his head forward to the edge of the couch. He was near the sofa and watched. He did not want to get close to his sister. His sister noticed the full dish and immediately picked it up using a rag, not her bare hands. She didn't want to use her hands, and carried it out. Remember that bowl? It had the milk and it had the bread, and it was full. Gregor could never have guessed what his sister, in her goodness, actually did bring. He was so happy. Why? Because she brought him a whole selection of things. There are many things for his breakfast. Spread out on an old newspaper. Half-rotten vegetables, so vegetables that are about to expire or are about to be no good. Bones from the evening meal. covered in white sauce, gone hard. The sauce is hard. Raisins and almonds and some cheese that Gregor himself had declared or said inedible, meaning you cannot eat them 2 days before. So 2 days before he said, I'm never going to eat those things. And then now that he's an insect, he said, I am going to eat those things. She poured some water into the dish and placed it beside them. Then, out of consideration for Gregor's feelings, she hurried out. She wanted him to eat in his own private time. Gregor's little legs whirred and shook from excitement. At last he could eat. Am I less sensitive than I used to be then? He thought, sucking greedily at the cheese, which almost compellingly attracted him much more than the other foods. His eyes watering with pleasure. There's water in his eyes because he was so happy. He consumed or ate the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh foods, on the other hand, he found not to his taste at all. From now on, Gregor received his food once in the morning while his parents and the maid were asleep, and after everyone had eaten their meal at midday. As nobody could understand him, because nobody could understand what he was saying, not even his sister. Though he could understand them, he had to be content or satisfied to hear his sister's sighs and appeals. Please, 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 please. Those are appeals to the saints as she moved about his room. Gregor would sometimes catch a friendly comment. He's enjoyed his dinner today. Or if he left most of it, which was becoming more frequent, she would say, sadly, everything's just been left again. Though Gregor wasn't able to hear any news directly, he did listen to what was said in the next rooms. All the talk was about what they should do now and how the maid had fallen to her knees and begged, please, 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 Gregor's mother to let her go without delay. She left within a quarter of an hour, tearfully thanking Gregor's mother for her dismissal, for firing her, and as if she had done her an enormous, a really big and important service. She even swore or promised emphatically not to tell anyone about what had happened. For the first 14 days, Gregor's parents could not bring themselves to come into the room to see him. His father and mother would wait outside the door while his sister tidied up, and as soon as she went out, she would tell them how everything looked, how Gregor had behaved, and whether any improvement could be seen. His mother wanted to go in and visit Gregor relatively soon, but his father and sister persuaded her against it, or told her, hey, it's not a good idea to do that. Out of consideration or care for his parents, Gregor tried to avoid being seen at the window during the day. So, during the day, he would hide somewhere dark so nobody could see him. But it was hard to just lie quietly. So, to entertain himself, doody-doody-doo, he took to or he started crawling up and down the walls and ceiling. He especially liked hanging from the ceiling. His body had a swing to it up there. He was almost happy. Now, of course, he had far better control of his own body. Soon, his sister noticed the traces of the sticky stuff or adhesive from his feet as he crawled about, and thought to make it as easy as possible for him by removing the furniture. Not something she could do by herself. But she did not dare ask for help from her dad or father, so she had no choice but to choose some time when Gregor's father was absent and fetch mother to help. First, his sister came in and looked round to see that everything in the room was all right, and only then did she let her mother enter. Gregor hurriedly put a sheet over himself and refrained from spying out from under it. He tried not to get out of that place. Old chest of drawers was too heavy for a pair of feeble or weak women, and Gregor listened as they pushed it. Push! Push! Did he really want his room transformed into a cave? They were taking away everything that was dear or important to him. So, while the women were catching their breath, he sallied out, not knowing what he should say first, until his attention was caught by the picture on the wall. He hurried up and pressed himself against its glass. Don't touch my picture. This picture, at least now totally covered by Gregor, would certainly be taken away by no one. No one can take this picture because I don't want my room to become a cave. Then there was someone at the door. His father had arrived home. What happened were his first words. Sister Greta's appearance must have made everything clear. Gregor got out. Ah! He shouted as he came in, both angry and glad at the same time. Gregor ran up to his father, stopped when his father stopped, scurried forwards again when he moved even slightly. In this way, they went round the room several times without anything decisive happening until something rolled in front of him. It was an apple, then another. Gregor froze in shock. He couldn't move. His father had filled his pockets with fruit from the bowl on the sideboard and now threw one apple after another. One glanced against Gregor's back without doing any harm. It didn't hurt him. Another one, however, immediately following it, hit squarely or right in the center and lodged in his body or got stuck in the body of Gregor. No one dared to remove the apple lodged or stuck in Gregor's flesh or body, so it remained there for more than a month. Because of his injuries, he was now reduced to the condition of an ancient invalid. He couldn't move, he couldn't eat, he couldn't play, he couldn't walk around. Crawling over the ceiling was out of the question. But this deterioration, he thought, was fully made up for by the door to the living room now being left open in the evenings. He got into the habit of lying in the darkness of his room to listen to their evening conversation with everyone's permission, in a way, and so quite differently from before. Who in this tired and overworked family would have had time to give attention to Gregor? The household budget, 预算, was now considerably shrunken, less than before. So the maid was dismissed, fired, to be replaced each morning and evening by an enormous, very big, thick-boned charwoman. Gregor even learned that several items of family jewelry had been sold. But the loudest complaint was that although the flat or apartment was much too big for their present circumstances, their flat or apartment was too big for these 3 people and an insect, they could not move out. Why not? Because there being no imaginable way of transferring Gregor to a new address. Hardly slept at all, either night or day. Gregor's sister no longer thought about how she could please him, but would hurriedly
carelessly pushed some food or other into his room with her foot before she rushed out to work in the morning. She still cleared up the room in the evening, but now smudges of dirt were left on the walls, and here and there were little balls of dust and fluff. Gregor's mother did once thoroughly clean his room using buckets of water, but the dampness or the wetness made Gregor ill and sick. Gregor's sister was exhausted and tired from going out to work, and looking after Gregor was even more work for her. Just by chance one day, the charwoman opened the door to Gregor's room and found herself face to face with him. He was taken entirely by surprise and began to rush to and fro, run back and forth, while she just stood there in amazement. From then on, she never failed to open the door slightly, or just a little bit, every evening and morning and look briefly in on him. So she would look at him, open the door every day for him. At first, she would call to him with words that she probably considered friendly, such as, "Hey, old dung beetle." Dung beetle is like a kind of insect that eats poo-poo. If only they had told this charwoman to clean up his room instead of just disturbing him. By now, Gregor had almost entirely stopped eating. If he happened to find himself next to the food, he might take some of it into his mouth to play with it, leave it there for a few hours, and then more often than not, spit it out again. They had got into the habit of putting things into his room that they had no place for anywhere else, and there were many, many such things, for one of the other rooms had been rented out to 3 gentlemen with full beards, and then the charwoman, being always in a hurry, would just chuck anything she couldn't use in there. At first, he moved stuff about because he was forced to make some space for himself, but later he came to enjoy it, though the exercise left him immobile, sad and tired to death for hours afterwards. Throughout all this time, Gregor could not remember having heard the violin being played, but this evening it began to be heard from the kitchen. Hearing too, the middle gentleman said, "Would the young lady like to come and play for us here in the room?" "Oh yes, we'd love to," Gregor's father called back. His sister began to play, and drawn in and attracted by the playing, Gregor dared to come forward, pushing his head a little into the living room. No one noticed him. Yet Gregor's sister was playing so beautifully, so Gregor crawled a little further forward, keeping his head close to the ground so that he could meet her eyes if the chance came. "Mr. Samsa?" shouted the middle gentleman, pointing with his forefinger. The violin went silent. The middle of the 3 gentlemen first smiled at his 2 friends, shook his head, and then looked back at Gregor. His father rushed up to the gentleman, his arms spread out, and attempted to drive them back into their room while trying to block their view of Gregor with his body. Gregor's father forgot all the respect he owed his tenants, and the middle gentleman shouted like thunder and stamped his foot. "I give immediate notice on my room." His friends joined in. With that, he took hold of the door handle and slammed the door, closed the door really loud. Gregor's father staggered back to his seat. "Father, mother," said his sister, banging the table. "We can't carry on like this. I don't want to call this monster my brother. All I can say is we have to try and get rid of it. We've done all anyone could do to look after it. No one could accuse us of doing anything wrong." "My child," said her father with sympathy, "what are we to do? If he could just understand us, but as it is..." "It's got to go!" shouted his sister. "We've got to rid ourselves of the idea that that's Gregor. If it were Gregor, he would have seen long ago that it's not possible for human beings to live with an animal like that. And he would have gone of his own free will. But this animal is persecuting us, is punishing us. It has driven out our tenants, the three gentlemen, and now it clearly wants to drive us out onto the streets." But Gregor had no wish to cause fear, least of all to his sister. He concentrated and focused on crawling as fast as he could until he had reached the doorway to his room. He was hardly inside before the door was shut and locked. Boom! "What now then?" Gregor asked himself as he looked around in the darkness. If it was possible, he felt that he must go away even more strongly than his sister. He remained in this state of empty and peaceful rumination. Rumination means thinking, until he heard the clock tower strike 3 in the morning. He watched as it slowly began to get light everywhere outside the window. Then, without his willing it, without his control, his head sank down completely, and his last breath flowed weakly from his nostrils. Nostrils are the nose holes. When the cleaner came in early in the morning, she poked at him a little. So you poke, you use your finger to touch something. And only when she found she could shove him across the floor with no resistance, with nobody saying, "No, don't touch me," at all, did she start to pay attention. She soon realized what had happened. "Come and have a look at this. It's dead, just lying there, stone dead." Mr. and Mrs. Samsa sat upright there in the marriage bed. Mr. Samsa threw a blanket over his shoulders. Mrs. Samsa just came out in her nightdress, and that's how they went into Gregor's room. On the way, they opened the door to the living room where Greta had been sleeping since the three gentlemen had moved in. She was already fully dressed, her face as pale as one who has not slept. "Dead?" asked Mrs. Samsa. "That's what I said," replied the cleaner. And to prove it, she gave Gregor's body another shove with the broom, sending it sideways across the floor. They decided that they were in serious need of relaxation, so they sat at a table and wrote 3 letters of excusal: Mr. Samsa to his employers, Mrs. Samsa to her contractor, and Greta to her principal. The cleaner came in while they were writing to say, that thing in there, you don't need to worry about how you're going to get rid of it. That's all been sorted out. I've taken care of it." Mr. Samsa saw that the cleaner wanted to start describing everything in detail, but with outstretched hand, he made it quite clear that she was not to. So she called out, "Cheerio, everyone," turned round and left, slamming the door, bam, fiercely as she went. After that, the 3 of them left the flat or apartment together, which was something they hadn't done for months, and took the tram out to the open country outside the town. They had the tram filled with warm sunshine all to themselves. All the time, Greta was becoming livelier. With all the worry they had been having of late, her cheeks had become pale or white. But while they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Samsa were struck, almost simultaneously or together, with the thought of how their daughter was blossoming into a well-built and beautiful young lady.